Thank you for that, and thank you, speakers. We'll move on to item 2.11, Chancellor's report. Chancellor.
Thank you, President Bonilla. Good evening, Vice President Reese and Board of Trustees, our public, community, colleagues, and visitors. For our item today for Chancellor's reports, we have 4 items. But for our first item, I'm going to invite Mark McCallum to talk with us today about the advocacy efforts that we have been making, or that his firm has been making on our behalf, and talk about some future directions. So Mark.
Great. And
thank
you, Chancellor, President Bonilla, trustees, administration, faculty, members of the public. Good to be here. I do miss not being there in person, but I'm sure you all miss that as well. But I'll go through a brief PowerPoint on this past year, and then what we expect for next year. And then happy to open it to any questions that you might have. So next slide. My name is Mark McDonald with McCallum Group. Just real quick, next slide. How we work. We do 2 conference calls every week, and your Chancellor has been participating in those. And she participated in them actually before becoming the Chancellor. But we do a Monday conference call, which is basically the day-to-day workings of the Capitol. If there's bills or Title V regulations that have been proposed, we'll go over those. And the idea is to get feedback from your on-the-ground staff that know the most about those issues, and then get that information back to us so that we can advocate on your behalf. And then the other conference call we have is on Thursday mornings, and Chancellor Walter participates in this one, and there are a number of other multi-college district chancellors that also participate in this call, and it provides an opportunity to go over high-level issues like the budget or other major issues that may be coming through, and it also provides an opportunity for the chancellors to share different issues that are going on at their local districts, either the challenges or the opportunities that they might have. From that call, we get direction moving forward as to how to best advocate on your behalf. Next slide. So just briefly going over the 2021 budget. As you know, it was a completely different budget in May than it had ended up in January when it was first introduced. And the COVID-19 pandemic put a real dent in the budget, where we had to deal with a $58 billion problem. Next slide. For Proposition 98, the majority of the issue was addressed with deferrals as opposed to cuts. 11 billion in deferrals for, that's all of Prop 98. So that's K-14. That's not just community colleges. Next slide. So the deferrals for community colleges were about 1.5 billion. And there is relief for districts that cannot meet obligations, but the total cap on each month of deferral system-wide is 30 million. Now, there was language that indicated that if the federal government came up with a stimulus package by October 15th, then most of those deferrals could be overturned, but that obviously didn't happen. I will say that it doesn't mean that they can't go in and make changes. The next budget proposal will be introduced in January. And, I will say right now, things are looking positive. If there's a change in administration and the Senate flips, then potentially in January, there could be a pretty major stimulus package that goes through that would then enable the state to roll back some of those deferrals. I will also add that for the first 3 months of the fiscal year, the first quarter of the fiscal year, the state has collected $8 billion more in revenues than they had projected in the Budget Act. Now, I would be cautiously optimistic on those two things because we still have another quarter before January of economic information before the governor introduces his budget in January. But we could see a situation where a good chunk of those deferrals do get overturned or reversed, which would provide some additional cash flow for you. Next slide. So some of the things that came out of our budget initiative moving forward was when we realized that there was a whole different ballgame with the global pandemic and that budgets were completely different at the local level as well. We advocated for a $120 million COVID-19 block grant, which was very flexible in how you could spend that money. I've heard a lot of discussions about mental health, getting students re-engaged. Those were all areas that funding could be spent, and it was allocated based on FTES. And then we had kind of another crisis when we found out that the CARES money from the federal government could not be used to help undocumented students. So we moved quickly, and there was 11 million in funding that was allocated for undocumented students. And this money goes out based on the number of AB 540 students that you have. And then two other items, there was $10 million in legal services for undocumented students, where you can partner with legal entities to provide services to your undocumented students. And then, another big issue for this district was the extension for 2 more years of the hold harmless while we try to deal with the inequities of the funding formula. Next slide. Other good news, a reduction in the employer contribution for PERS and STIRS for the next 2 years of about 2% for each one. Next slide. And then the Calbright College was reduced. It was actually the only college that took a cut. Everybody else took deferrals, but ongoing money was hit by 5 million and one-time funds reduced by 40 million. Next slide. So I'll just go over quickly some bills that were signed, some pertinent bills that the governor signed and will go into effect January 1st. Next slide. The first one is AB 1460. This is the CSU Ethnic Studies Bill, and it would require the CSU colleges to offer courses in ethnic studies in the 21-22 academic year. And then by 24-25, students who graduate would have to have at least one course in ethnic studies. And even though it's a CSU requirement, it will impact community college students. And I'll get to a budget request at the end regarding this, because it'll impact what happens if students take an ethnic studies course at a community college, how that transfers. Does it impact the ADTs as students work to go from a community college to a CSU, and only do 60 units. Next slide. The next one is AB 2288. This provides you some flexibility in your clinical placements on your nursing programs. Allows you to do what's called simulation, because during the pandemic, it was difficult to get students into clinical placements. So this provides some flexibility while there's a state of emergency. Next slide. AB 2884, very positive measure. It allows you to use your lottery funds to provide grants to students for housing and food insecurity. Before, you can only use them for instructional materials. This provides some flexibility for those funds. There's not a lot of them, but it's a pot of money that you can access now for some much needed services. Next slide. And then the final one was the College Promise. This was extended to members of the armed forces who may get pulled away for active duty and they're no longer considered first-time students. They would be able to come back and still be considered first-time students and be able to access free tuition. Next slide. And then finally, the Education Trailer Bill had two things. Again, lottery funds allow you to purchase electronics. So one of the big issues was getting laptops into the hands of students, and then connectivity to the internet for students. You could use your lottery funds to purchase those for students. And then it adds the lieutenant governor as a voting member of the Board of Governors. So she would be the only ad hoc member, so to speak. The governor nor the treasurer or any of the other statewide offices serve on the Board of Governors. Excuse me. Next slide. We have two major ballot measures that will impact higher education this year. Next slide. They are Prop 15. I mean, as you all know, I'm sure, Prop 15 split roll property tax, and then Prop 16, which would end the ban on affirmative action. Just quickly, I have a couple slides with the polling on it, but when I submitted the PowerPoint, it was a couple weeks ago, so I do have some new polling. Next slide. So Prop 15, the split roll, would, when it's fully implemented, it'll be implemented over about 4 years. When it's fully implemented, it would be about 11.9 or 12 million in additional revenue to Peralta. It's been slightly up in most polls, but it's been around 50%. In the most recent PPIC poll, it was 49% yes, 46% no. So the bottom line is it's going to be a very close vote. And then next slide. Proposition 16 actually has been moving more in the positive direction the last couple weeks. So early polls about a month ago had it slightly behind, but I just got a new poll from David Bender Research earlier today that had the measure tied at 45%, with 10% undecided. And I think on this one, it's really gonna matter where the undecided voters come in, or the ones that are registered as no party preference. It's favored heavily by Democrats, opposed by Republicans. So it's really going to matter, like I said, where the no party preference votes come in on this one. Next slide. So issues for next year, just kind of a couple major issues that have boiled up to the top that we'll continue to discuss. as we go into January in the next legislative session. Next slide. So the Board of Governors submits a request every year to the Department of Finance for consideration in their January budget. And I'll just go over these quickly. One is a request for an automatic property tax backfill like K-12 has. And then I heard earlier in the discussion from the Academic Senate mentioned this, a focus on faculty and staff diversity. And there's a suite of requests that are being made to improve faculty and staff diversity. And that includes 20 million for equal employment opportunity implementation, money for a statewide fellowship program that would help transition graduate students into faculty positions, some more money for full-time faculty hiring, and then, as I mentioned earlier, money for a task force focused on successful implementation of the ethnic studies requirement. And community colleges are going to have to be at the table for that discussion. And then highlighting a couple other things, 50 million for a student emergency support and response block grant. And this would be similar to that 120 million COVID-19 block grant that we received this year. Next slide. Funding for mental health, funding for the Emoja program, funding for implementation of a transfer guarantee to historically Black colleges and universities, and then Cal Grant reform are all on the table. And then, of course, the capital outlay program, which includes the acceleration of the College of Alameda Aviation Complex that was approved at the end of the legislative session this year. Next slide. There'll be Assemblyman Medina will carry a bill to expand and extend the community college baccalaureate degree program, authorizing more colleges to offer programs. Next slide. There's going to be discussions around funding formula reform. Like this district in hold harmless, there needs to be a way to get out of hold harmless, and those discussions are going to happen this year. Next slide. Transfer reform, the master plan, or the committee on the master plan for higher education has focused on transfer reform this year. So there's going to be a lot of discussions around, particularly the ADT, what's gone right, what's gone wrong, how we can improve students getting from community colleges to four-year universities. Next slide. And then non-credit, providing some incentive for colleges to offer short-term vocational programs by changing the way non-credit vocational programs are funded. So with that, I know it's a lot of information. Happy to take any questions that there might be at this time.
Thank you for that, Mark. And we will look for trustees to either raise their hands or indicate that they have some questions. I'll ask Mark to help me scan. And so I want to thank you for this presentation. It's a very comprehensive overview of what's going on at our state capitol. And I do see Trustee Brown in the queue.
Sorry, I was a bit slow on the uptake there, trying to push the right buttons on this.
Okay.
Hi, Mark. How are you?
Hi, Trustee. How are you?
I'm doing good. So a while back, you and Patrick were helping us with the student-centered funding formula assessment, or I should say consideration of the cost of living in the Bay Area and I'm wondering if that's going anywhere, or I should say, what is the status? Have we made any headway? Is there any thought about addressing the high cost of living in certain areas of California?
Yeah, that's being readily discussed. I think there's two things going on. There is in statute one of the, I think, downfalls of the funding formula is there are too many cooks in the kitchen at this point. But there is the statutory funding formula oversight committee that's meeting and has been discussing that, and they've been deadlocked. And then there is the Community College League funding formula task force, and that's chaired by Willie Duncan at Sierra College, and he is not one of our clients, but I've been in constant contact and communication with him, and they're looking at that right now. And I think with our group that we have that meets on Thursdays, because I think the majority of those districts are in hold harmless at this time, that is something that's going to be discussed. Just to be honest, it got shelved last year because of the pandemic. And there was a complete 90-degree turn and urgency on what needed to get done. But that's going to be addressed this year. One of the other things they're looking at is on that, Trustee Brown, is an adjustment to your regional in your regional federal financial aid take. So you adjust your cost of living with the federal government, and that would in turn impact the number of Pell Grant students that you get locally. But to answer your question, that still is on the table. It's something that's going to be discussed this year, and I think there's going to be an outcome this year.
One follow-up question, that there was also the issue of certain areas such as Alameda County, LA County, having a higher number of formerly incarcerated students, people who were who had a ability to benefit, may not be may not be Pell eligible because of some of the changes when the Pell was negotiated in the prior federal higher ed package. So is there a discussion regarding including students or categories of students that need more support, foster kids, yeah, formerly incarcerated, and not counting them only once, but right, if there's, that was part of it. There are people who were, if they were duplicated, they need the money because of certain different challenges, but they were counted once, which means if you're in an area that has a lot of people in that category, you still need the money, but you're not getting it. So just right, wondering where that is, if we might get some relief in that area.
Yes. So you're talking about students that are basically would otherwise be Pell eligible, except for perhaps they were formerly incarcerated and they no longer qualify for a Pell.
Yeah.
So, correct?
Yeah. Or, still, what is it called? Justice impacted. You could be out, but still have the connections. So you're not getting the Pell, but you need the Pell, and the housing's expensive. Just a whole bunch of things start to pile on.
Right. But you otherwise would be Pell eligible. Yeah.
Exactly.
There are discussions about folding that in and also looking at foster youth as well.
Okay, well, that is extremely important. So if we could sort of keep our eye on that would be great to see how we're doing, because there'll be opportunities for federal advocacy, and it would be good to know. Well, you always do that for us. You always help us with the state and the federal advocacy. So it'd be good to keep an eye on that.
Yeah, and there's some synergy there with the new with the funding formula.
All right, thanks.
Thank you for that. Any other questions from trustees? And if not, I want to thank you, Mark, for coming out and giving this presentation. And we'll see you soon.
Thank you, President
Did I
Bonilla.
freeze?
I'm hoping that next year I can do it in person.
Yes, yes, it's a good goal.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Chancellor?
Thank you so much, Mark. Really great. So I'm going to move on. I would invite people, individuals, trustees to read the president's reports, but we're going to move on to our presentation, item 3.1.